What's the most corrupt thing you've witnessed your employer do? One time when I was a chef in college, I worked 14 days straight, with half of those days being 12-hour days. This all fell in one pay period too. It was rough, but it was summer and I was gushing over the amount of overtime I was about to get. It came out to like over 70 hours overtime. I was supposed to get almost an additional $1,000 on my paycheck. I calculated the math with tax and everything and couldn't wait to pick up my paycheck the next week for that pay period. I pick it up, and the paycheck is quite larger than I'm used to, given I normally only work 25 hours a week, but there is zero overtime on it. It was short almost $1,000. I got to the HR office the next day. It was located at a different casino, and asked, and they go, yeah, so in Nevada, you only qualify for overtime if you average 40 hours a week normally. That sounded like bullshit to me, but I asked my mom, who used to run finances for our family business, and she says that is in fact 100% bullshit. She pulled up the statute online and it clearly said if you exceed 8 hours in a day, you get overtime. It said nothing about a weekly average, so printed that bitch out and drove right back down to the HR office, and showed it to them. The lady at the desk who just told me that like calls out the head of HR. She would frequent the different locations to check in with people and was always nice, but you could always tell she was shady as fuck. They both seemed to get very nervous and in a stuttering voice, okay, we will reevaluate. I never heard anything or got any apology, but when the next paycheck came, the exact amount of overtime I calculated was put on that paycheck down to the penny. I tell some of the other guys in the kitchen what happened, and apparently the family who owned the casino or restaurant was located and was known for pulling shit like this, making accounting errors, knowing a lot of people who do direct deposit don't even look at their pay stubs. Funny how these accounting errors always ended up in saving the company money, and never gave the employee extra cash. Lol. A server no more than a few months later had the same exact shit happen to him. Rat bastards. Man, I feel ya. My old job was 5 days on, 4 off, 5 on 5 off, then 4 on 5 off. Stupid to stay on top of pay, right? It gets better. They intentionally hold on to some of your money so to equalize your pay. Gets more great. I also get bonus per hour due to the nature of my job. The hourly rate is paid bi-weekly, and the bonus is semi-monthly. I have absolutely no fucking clue what I'm supposed to get paid and to stay on top of what's owed. Had a job out of college selling Yellow Pages advertising. A big part of the job was just renewing the old ads in the book, and we had to call each business to have them renew their ad. But as the Yellow Pages book became more and more obsolete, more customers would cancel their ads. So the company changed the policy of having us call each business and instead put in a policy that any customer who didn't specifically call to cancel would be auto-renewed. Then they would purposefully send out the renewal notices late enough that the customers couldn't cancel in time to avoid the following year's charges. If one of us did actually get a call from a customer looking to cancel and with time to legitimately do so, and we actually canceled them, fired. I worked for a company like that. The customer service reps, people who would field the customer calls asking for returns, were graded and given bonuses for how many sales they saved. Saved meaning how many people who called to return our products they tricked into holding on to it past the full refund window. I saw this from the other end. Worked for U-Haul in the late 90s, early aughts. They were one of the biggest Yellow Pages advertisers. This was when the internet was just destroying the heap. We went from a whole department just dedicated to designing and placing ads for hundreds of locations to a few people following the dregs. Growing up, my father always told me to save my pay stubs and time receipts. I ended up working a job in my early 20s at an airport moving cars. I get my paycheck one day and I realize that it's not right. So I do a little digging, and a lot of math, and I figure out that the company was taking hours from me. I ask around and it turns out that they were taking hours from literally everyone at the job site. After doing more math, we figured out that over the 6 months we all worked together, the company had stolen a combined 400 hours from 8 people. Would you like to know why? It's because if you steal from your boss, you go to prison. If your boss steals from you, it usually doesn't get reported. If it does get reported, there's no jail time, but you have the option to sue. Suing takes years and the judgment doesn't usually amount to all that was stolen, and your lawyer takes their cut out of the judgment. The ruling class made theft profitable when they do it, and unprofitable when we do it, and that is why they're the country's biggest thieves. Worked in a restaurant that didn't allow employees to work over 40 hours as they did not want to pay any overtime. Instead, if you wanted to work extra or if they asked you to work extra, they would delete hours off of your time card to keep it under 40. They always asked you when they did that in a kind of hush-hush way, so it wasn't exactly without permission, but I think it was bullshit all the same. I was working at a small brewery bar and caught the owner dipping into the tip jar at the end of big nights. It was a new place that just opened and was kind of struggling during the off-season. We literally had a staff of 2 bartenders and the owner's husband and wife, so the bar staff would pool and split that day's tips. Come to find out that he was taking a cut of the tips because he worked there too. When I confronted him, I explained that it's actually a violation of the FLSA. In fact, it's even an exact example listed as illegal things to do with tips. He argued that it was his right as owner and fired me, so I reported him to Department of Labor. My girlfriend used to work at a deli where the owner was taking half the tips. She's never worked food, so she suspected it was wrong, but didn't know for sure. She asked me like, hey, is this normal? As I was a chef for a couple of years, and I explained how taking tips as the owner is probably the most frowned upon thing you can do in the food service industry. My sister worked at a hot dog restaurant when she was an HS, and the same exact thing happened there. The manager kept all the tips, and they also forced another kid to pay for a donut making machine that he broke BC he wasn't trained to use it properly. This place was selling hot dogs for like $7 and getting rich off the hard work of 16-year-olds. Assholes. If you're ever in Toronto, don't go to the fancy hot dog restaurant with a wiener dog logo. When I used to housekeep at a hotel, our head housekeeper would go into all of our checkouts and steal our tips before we could get to them. I remember a few times seeing tips in my rooms and foolishly not thinking to pick them up before they disappeared. A few of my other co-workers witnessed similar instances. At one point, a guest came up to me and said she'd leave a big tip in her room for me. BC, it was a mess. I found out later that the head housekeeper cleaned the room herself. She walked out like a year later. BC, our GM demoted her to regular housekeeper. BC, everyone had complaints about her. She was a very awful person in general. I was a mechanic that found out that the company was not letting me fix customers' cars that had oil leaks when the customers had paid for a 200k mile warranty. The manager would tell the service writer to say that the warranty company declined it, and eventually started making me take a photo to him so that he could tell me that the leak wasn't bad enough to fix. The customer paid for a warranty and the company wasn't holding up their end of the deal because it was costing them money. They are one of the most profitable car dealerships in my town and now have 3 dealerships and are expanding. My first car I bought from a used dealership had a warranty that I thought was great at first until I saw the dealer's receipt for my replaced engine. I had blown the engine like 6 months after buying the car, and with the warranty, it cost me nothing to replace. Did it again a few months later and same process. except when I got it back this time someone had left the receipt for the engine they put in my car. The engine cost them $90 from a junkyard. I replaced 3 engines in that car and finally traded it in before I had to get a 4th. I have another one that I remembered after seeing a comment, not so much corrupted employer but employee. I worked for an insurance brokerage. There was a broker that was also on the town hall committee. Our brokerage handled their liability insurance, so when it came time to pay their insurance premiums she took the check and deposited the money into her own bank account. So because of the type of insurance they had, it was something called broker billed, meaning the brokerage would pay for the premiums and it was our job to ensure we got the money and cancel policies if they were in arrears. This woman eventually got fired because she was very far behind on handling customers, and all of this came out in the Washington. Turns out, she stole a few $1,000s from the town committee. Keep in mind the community is only like a few hundred people, so yeah, small town drama. I think she ended up moving after. I've had a couple that tried to pressure you to work off the clock, without actually asking you to do so in order not to get sued. Suckered some people into doing it. If they complained after the fact they got canned, and by that I mean they got all hours cut until they were forced to quit so they couldn't file for unemployment. I just made it clear I wasn't playing their games in the first place. First time they tried me I was like, isn't that working off the clock? And they were like, oh no, of course not. We're not asking that at all. Just looking for volunteers. I can't volunteer. Do you want me to stay clocked in? Or go home since my shift is over? Oh well, I suppose you can go home. We'll figure it out. Needless to say, they did not like me much after that and made working there a living hell. Cut my hours to low numbers. But not altogether. But I had already asked my old boss if they'd take me back, which they welcomed me back with open arms. Only reason I took the new job was they paid like $3 an hour more. But ob's not worth it if I'm expected to work for free. I've been through several jobs where you're expected to pay your dues to earn a more desirable position. I've learned that the more they expect you to pay your dues at a crappy job, the less likely you are to have any upward mobility. If a company cares about investing in its employees, they usually start with decent base pay and benefits. Otherwise they're likely just looking for cheap disposable labor which they lure in with fake promises. For anyone experiencing the cut hours thing, it's called constructive dismissal, and in many states, check your own, you're still eligible for unemployment. Expected to get declined the first time, appeal and explain. If more people did this, employers would have a harder time doing this shit, in part because the employees so victimized getting unemployment would cause a rise in costs to the former employer. Had my hours cut down to about 8 hours a week. Saw on my schedule that that's how it was gonna be from now on. Went and threatened my manager that I was gonna file for partial unemployment. He told me there's no such thing. I told him he could either look it up himself or find out when my paperwork showed up in his mailbox from the country office of Human Resources. Next day I had an email informing me of a schedule change. Went and checked and all my hours had been bumped back up. This happened to me in college. I was working at a high-volume upscale jewelry store and liked working in the warehouse. They really wanted me working sales because I was a young, fit female. They figured that I could upsell men buying jewelry for women. First they tried to get me to switch by implying that I made mistakes by switching a packing label on me. They sent a baby shower gift to a new, very not pregnant, bride and blamed it on me. They agreed to forgive me if I switched to sales. When I still didn't want to switch, they cut my hours. Incidentally, the store is still in business but is in no way considered upscale any longer. I guess their business practices caught up with them. Yup, I had to do this. Worked for a bookstore and our dead part of the year kicked in. This was back in 2008 to 2010ish and jobs were hard to come by in my area. So I kept working minimum wage at 14 hours a week. We were going to starve soon. I filed partial unemployment, and after 2 payments, suddenly my company could give me 32 40-hour weeks. Crazy how they could suddenly afford to work me full-time. They would only do this for 2 weeks though, 'cause after so many weeks of full-time they would have to offer benefits, so every 3rd week would be less than 20. Whatever, we made it through the skinny times at least. I refiled every time I went more than 2 weeks without full hours. They filed bankruptcy about 10 years ago and died. I loved that job, but the company was just sad. Not as bad as some others in this thread, but it still really pissed me off. I worked for a very large telecom company. They would do things around election time like ask for donations to the super PAC that they were a part of for the good of the company, or send a recommended list of people, topics that we should vote for in the elections, in so many words. But what really got me pissed off was when net neutrality was becoming a huge topic. They sent everyone an email explicitly stating that they were in favor of net neutrality and that we had nothing to worry about if we heard the company name mentioned on the news or in court when it came to that topic, and that they were on the side of the consumer and being free to visit the sites you wanted to visit with no catch. Of course that was a lie, because when numbers came out for what companies were lobbying and spending how much money for what side of the argument, they were one of the top contributors against net neutrality. It's one thing to be a greedy corporation and not tell your employees how you're being greedy and underhanded. It's a completely different level to straight up lie to their faces about it in a company-wide email. TBH, I can't remember, as I worked there about 15 years ago, but more than likely they were. The company is still in operation, illegally, and I just read a news article about them, from 2016. The article said the reporter called the place to try to dispute the ticket, and the person they spoke to threatened them with legal action if they didn't pay the ticket. When the news tried to contact them, the company refused to speak to the reporters. The article also stated that the company takes in over $600 million annually in parking fees. I used to work at a place that was owned by an organization with some political affiliations. There was a rich Middle Eastern investor who owed my employer money, literally millions, from a contract that they simply never paid. It was quite a sensitive issue and one that everyone really wanted to keep out of court. Some negotiations took place and the investor agreed to pay, but in return, wanted a spot on the board. Everything was agreed. The guy would pay, and then there would be a big party event, with some press, for his appointment to the board. At any rate, a few weeks before this was supposed to happen, the head of my organization became very ill and needed surgery and was gone for several weeks. The big party where the investor would become a member of the board had to be delayed. It turns out, our big boss wasn't actually sick at all and did not need to have surgery. Actually, what happened was, the head of the organization that owned my employer was running for political office and was worried about the optics of the whole event, only being able to get this rich Middle Eastern dude to pay us what he owed by putting him on the board and granting him a bunch of power over the organization, and basically ordered their boss to feign a long illness that would require the event to be delayed until after the election. At the first company I worked at, the general manager had all his personal expenses paid by the company. His wife also had a company credit card and was paid a salary, but she didn't work. The company paid for things like their groceries, house mortgage, car payments and family vacations. The kicker is he wasn't the owner of the company. He had a creative accountant that hid these expenses, but the owners became suspicious and they hired an auditor. It took them about 4 years to figure it out. He was fired and his family fled the country, so I'm not sure what happened to him. A few years ago I was living at a McDonald's in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. The area manager decided to save the store, so she became very involved in its day-to-day micromanagement. One payday morning she made an announcement that, because everyone kept coming and asking for their checks and bothering her, She would be giving them to us when she felt we deserved them. I called the local Department of Labor, who referred me to the state, who referred me back to local, who then told me they just didn't care and weren't looking into it. It eventually resolved itself anyway when she handed checks out the next day.